She pulled a fence post from the ground, and the ground gave it up too easily. No resistance, no roots, no 40 years of packed earth fighting back. Just a hollow thunk, and then silence, and then something impossible staring up at her from a stone-lined pit beneath the prairie soil. A woman alone on an abandoned ranch. A fence that wasn't built to hold livestock. And a secret so dangerous that the man who buried it never dared speak it aloud. He just kept building, post by post, mile by mile, hiding the truth inside the very boundary meant to contain it. Before this story ends, a cattle empire will crack. A family's stolen name will be returned, and one ordinary fence builder will have to choose between walking away safe or standing her ground. Stay with me until the very end because this one doesn't let go. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button and become part of our family. Drop a like and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The job listing had been brief to the point of being rude. Fence restoration. Black Ridge Ranch, Cutter County. 6 weeks, possibly 8. Tools provided. Previous experience with post and rail required. Contact Holloway Land Management. Rowan Mercer had read it twice in the parking lot of a diner outside Amarillo, sitting in her truck with a breakfast burrito going cold in her lap, and exactly $214 left in her checking account. She wasn't desperate, not technically. She had a reputation, a trailer full of equipment, and 12 years of field work that most men in her trade would never accumulate in a lifetime. But the truth was the truth. It was late March, the spring contracts hadn't come through the way she'd expected, and her truck needed new rear tires before it needed anything else. She called the number. A man named Dale Pruitt answered on the fourth ring, sounding like he'd rather be doing almost anything else. Yeah, Black Ridge, it's a restoration job, not a new build. The property's been sitting vacant since, well, a long time. The existing fence line is there mostly. You'd be pulling the bad posts, resetting what can be saved, replacing what can't. Straightforward. Who owns it now? Rowan asked. Silas Holloway. Old family. The ranch has been in receivership for years, but he's retained ownership on paper. He wants the boundary fence made legal again before he decides what to do with the property. How many acres? About 800. Fence line runs close to 3 miles around the perimeter. 3 miles of restoration. 6 weeks of work. The pay was fair. Not generous, but fair. She said yes before he finished quoting the day rate. She drove to Black Ridge the following Monday. The ranch sat at the end of a county road that hadn't been graded since the previous decade. Her truck bounced over Kalish and Creek crossings for nearly 4 miles before the property came into view, and Rowan's first impression was that the land itself looked tired. Not ugly, just worn down. The kind of exhaustion that comes from being argued over and neglected in equal measure. The old ranch house was still standing, barely. The windows were boarded. A dead cottonwood had fallen against the east side of the porch, and nobody had thought to move it. The barn was in better shape, newer roof, or at least newer than the house, and there was a water pump near the trough that still functioned, though it groaned like something in pain every time she worked the handle. She set up her camp in the barn. She'd done worse. The fence was visible from where she parked, a long, uneven line of cedar posts and rusting wire that wound around the edge of the property, dipping in and out of draws, crossing a dry creek bed in the southwest corner, eventually disappearing over a low ridge to the north. Some sections had collapsed entirely. Others were leaning at angles that suggested they'd given up years ago, but hadn't quite fallen. A few stretches looked almost intact, the wire still strung tight, the posts still vertical, which struck her as odd given how long the place had been empty. She walked the line on her first morning, the way she always did before touching anything. Get a sense of it, understand what you're dealing with before you start making decisions you can't take back. She carried a notebook. She made marks. Length of each section, condition of posts, whether the wire needed to be restrung or simply retightened. She noted the hardware, some of it old enough to be hand-forged, some of it mid-century galvanized, some of it surprisingly recent and completely inconsistent with the rest. Somebody had done patchwork on this fence at different points over the decades. That wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the inconsistency of the foundation. The post depths varied more than they should, and in several places the post spacing was irregular in ways she couldn't immediately explain. She made a note. Spacing uneven. Check for settling or original install error. She didn't think much of it. Not yet. Wood. The first strange post was in the northwest corner. She found it on her third day, after she'd cleared and reset 2 full sections of collapsed fence along the southern boundary and was feeling the particular satisfaction of work that was going cleanly. The northwest corner marker post was a cedar trunk, thicker than most of the others, set deep, or so she assumed until she put a claw bar under it to check the depth before deciding whether to pull and replace or simply brace. The post moved. Not a little. Not with the grudging resistance of something half-freed from the earth. It moved all at once, like something sitting on top of the ground with just enough weight to stay put. She let go of the claw bar and stared. She reached down and grabbed the post with both hands, lifted straight up. It came free with a sound she'd never heard a fence post make. A dry, hollow shush, like something being uncorked. And beneath it, where the post hole should have been, packed dirt, gravel, 40 years of compressed earth, there was instead a chamber. Not a natural void, a chamber. Somebody had lined it with flat stones, dry stacked with the kind of careful patience that takes time and intention. The stones had been fitted together tightly enough that dirt had barely filtered in around the edges. Inside the chamber, wrapped in what had once been canvas and was now more the color and texture of dried bark, was an object roughly the size and shape of a large book. Rowan stood up straight, looked left, looked right, as if someone might be watching, which was ridiculous. She was alone on 800 acres of empty land. The nearest paved road was 4 miles back, and the wind was the only thing moving anywhere on the horizon. She looked back down at the chamber. What in the... She didn't finish the sentence. She just crouched back down, took the wrapped object in both hands, and lifted it out. The canvas unwrapped in layers, stiff and fragile in a way that made her slow down and be careful. Inside was a tin box. The tin was old, the kind of flat, plain container that used to hold tobacco or biscuits or anything else that needed to stay dry. It had been sealed along the lid with what appeared to be wax, or something that had started as wax and dried into something harder over the years. She didn't try to open it. Not there. Not on her knees in the dirt with the wind picking up from the northwest and the light already starting to move toward afternoon. She set the tin box aside, placed the canvas next to it, and looked back into the stone chamber. Empty. She checked with her fingers, feeling along the stones, half expecting. She didn't know what she was expecting. Nothing. The chamber was clean. She replaced the canvas in the chamber, sat the tin box on top of it, and stood up again. Her knees hurt. She was 38 years old and her knees always hurt by mid-afternoon, which she considered a personal failing she had no intention of addressing. She should call Dale Pruitt. That was the obvious move. You find something unexpected on a job site, you call the property contact, you let them handle it. She knew that. She had a number in her phone and she'd used it twice already in the past 3 days. Once about the water pump, once about a property line marker that had been moved and needed to be verified against the original survey documents. She stood there for a full minute, thinking about it. Then she picked up the tin box, carried it to her truck, and locked it in the toolbox behind the cab. She went back to work. She told herself it was just curiosity, that she'd open the box that evening, see what was inside, and if it was nothing, old junk, somebody's forgotten keepsake, the kind of thing that gets buried and forgotten, she'd mention it to Pruitt the next morning and let him decide what to do with it. That was reasonable. That was proportionate. But somewhere between the northwest corner and the next section of fence, something shifted in the way she was walking the line. She started looking differently. Not at the wire. Not at the condition of the posts. At the posts themselves. The way they were set. The angle of the ground around them. Whether the dirt looked disturbed in a way that wasn't just weather and time. She walked slowly. She tapped posts with the handle of her claw bar, listening to the sound each one made, the dull thud of solid ground or the slightly hollow note of something that wasn't packed the way it should be. She found the second one about 60 yards from the first. This post came free harder than the first one. The stones around it had settled more, and she had to work the bar underneath before it would lift. But when it did, the chamber was there. Same construction, same careful stonework. This one didn't contain a tin box. It held a rolled piece of oilcloth, tightly bound with wire that had fused to the cloth itself with age. She didn't unwrap it in the field. She carried it back to her truck. She found the third one before sundown. By the time the light had gone low enough to make the work dangerous, she had 3 objects from 3 posts, all of them in her toolbox, and a map she'd begun drawing in her notebook. The rough outline of the fence perimeter with X marks at the locations of each strange post. She sat in the barn that evening with her camp lantern and her notebook and the objects arranged in front of her like a puzzle she didn't have all the pieces to yet. She opened the tin box first. Inside, wrapped in a single sheet of folded paper that crumbled slightly at the creases, was a set of handwritten notes. Not a letter. Not exactly. More like a record. Dates, measurements, compass bearings. The handwriting was small and deliberate, the kind of script that belonged to someone who had spent a lifetime making careful notes and knew the difference between writing something down and actually documenting it. The numbers meant something. She could see that, but she didn't have enough context yet to know what. She unrolled the oilcloth next. Inside was a map, hand-drawn on heavy paper, in pencil so fine and consistent it might have been done by a draftsman. It showed a section of land. She could see the creek, the ridge, the general shape of the property she was standing on, but the boundary lines didn't match what she'd been walking all week. She looked at the map for a long time. Then she looked at her notebook, at the rough sketch of the fence line she'd been building for days. The difference wasn't dramatic. Maybe 80 feet at the widest point, but the map showed the boundary running east of where the actual fence stood, east and further toward the creek. She set the map down, picked up her notebook, did a rough calculation in her head, then scratched it out with pencil and did it again. 80 feet, over a mile of boundary. That was close to 10 acres. Maybe more, depending on the angles. 10 acres didn't sound like much. 10 acres that included the only reliable water source on the southern edge of the property, the creek she'd crossed twice already this week, the one that ran year-round according to the county drainage maps she'd downloaded before the job. That was something different. She sat with that for a while. She barely slept. She lay in her sleeping bag on a camp cot in the corner of the barn, listening to the wind work through the gaps in the siding, and she went back and forth on it. What she had might be nothing. Old survey documents, a rancher's personal records, somebody's private mapping project stored away decades ago for reasons she couldn't guess. Ranchers did strange things. People who worked land had their own relationship to it that didn't always translate into anything an outsider could understand cleanly. But the chamber construction bothered her. You didn't dry stack stones into a post hole to store something meaningless. That kind of work took hours. It took tools and intention and the certainty that whatever you were hiding needed to last. Somebody had hidden these things to last, and somebody had built the fence around them, post by post, so that the only way to find the hiding places was to pull the fence apart. At 4 a.m, she gave up on sleep, got up, and sat at the small folding table she used as a desk with a flashlight and her notebook. She turned to a fresh page and started writing out what she knew in plain language, the way her first field supervisor had taught her years ago when she was a 26-year-old apprentice who got confused by her own notes. What do I have? She wrote the question and underlined it. 3 posts with hidden chambers, 2 containing documents, 1 containing a sealed tin with measurement records, a hand-drawn map showing a different boundary line than the current fence, at least 2 more posts that felt wrong when I tapped them. Didn't get to check those before dark. She stopped, tapped her pen on the page. If there are more posts like these, how many are there? Spaced? How? Does the spacing mean anything? Is there a pattern? She turned to the sketch of the fence line she'd been building, marked the 3 posts she'd found, looked at the spacing between them. 60 yards from post 1 to post 2. She hadn't measured to the 3rd one exactly. Tomorrow, she decided. First light. She'd walk the full line again, systematically, every post in sequence. She'd take proper measurements. She'd document every suspicious one before she opened anything else. She knew she should call Pruitt. She knew she wasn't going to, not yet. This isn't mine, she said aloud, to no one, to the barn and the dark and the wind. I know that. She said it, and then she did not call. Dawn came in gray and cold. the kind of March morning that reminded you that spring was a suggestion out here rather than a commitment. Rowan was in the field before the sun cleared the ridge, walking the fence line from the northwest corner where she'd started, moving systematically south. She tested every post she came to, tapping first, then pressing, then if something felt off, putting the bar under it and checking. Most were exactly what they should be, locked into the earth, unwilling to move, firmly rooted in decades of compressed soil. Those she marked with a blue chalk line and kept moving, but some were not. She found 4 more chambers before noon. 2 were empty. The stonework was there. The careful construction was there. But whatever had been inside was gone. Whether removed or never placed, she couldn't know. The other 2 held objects, another oilcloth roll that she set in the truck without opening, and a glass jar sealed with a wax-dipped cork that held a folded paper inside. The writing still clear despite everything. By the time the sun was directly overhead and she stopped to drink water and eat the sandwich she'd made that morning, she had a full sketch of the fence line with every post marked, blue for normal, red for suspicious. She counted the red marks. 9. Out of approximately 140 posts along the full perimeter, 9 had been built as hiding places. She stared at the distribution. The red marks weren't random, they were clustered. Heavier concentration along the western boundary, spaced in a pattern that almost looked regular once she drew lines connecting them. She flipped to a clean page in her notebook, drew the boundary line, connected the 9 red marks. The line they formed was not the fence line. It was a different line, running parallel to the fence, but offset, consistently offset, in the same direction, by roughly the same distance she'd seen in the hand-drawn map the night before. She sat down on a fence rail that was barely holding its own weight and stared at what she'd drawn until her eyes felt dry. Whatever this fence was protecting, it wasn't cattle. It was a lie. And somebody had spent a very long time building the truth into the structure of the lie itself, trusting that the ground would hold it until someone came along who knew how to listen to what a fence post was really saying. She didn't know yet whose truth it was, or who the lie had been built against, or what it had cost the people caught between them. But she was going to find out. She closed the notebook, tucked it under her arm, and walked back to her truck. The afternoon was still ahead of her. There was still work to do. She picked up her claw bar and went back to the fence. The oilcloth roll sat on her folding table for 2 hours before she touched it. She'd eaten dinner, canned soup heated on a camp stove, crackers from a sleeve that had been open too long and were starting to soften. And she'd washed her face with cold water from the pump and changed out of her work shirt, and she'd done all of that slowly, deliberately, the way you put off something you know is going to change the shape of your evening, maybe the shape of more than that. The barn was quiet. Outside, the wind had settled into a low, steady push from the northwest, the kind that didn't rattle things so much as just lean on them. Her camp lantern threw a circle of yellow light across the table. She pulled the oilcloth roll toward her and began working the wire loose. It had fused to the outer layer in places, the metal and cloth having spent so many decades pressed together that they'd essentially become one material. She had to use her knife to carefully separate them without tearing the cloth itself. Slow work. The kind that required patience she didn't always have, but had learned to fake when the situation demanded it. Inside were 2 items. The first was a folded document, not handwritten this time, but typed, on paper so old the edges had gone amber and brittle. She unfolded it with both hands, slowly, and held it under the lantern. It was a land survey. Official-looking, formatted the way county survey documents from the mid-20th century tended to be, with a heading that listed the parcel number, the county, and a date, September 14th, 1962. The measurements were precise, compass bearings, chain lengths, benchmark references. At the bottom, 2 signature lines. One was signed in ink that had faded to a ghostly brown. The other line was blank. She stared at the blank signature line for a long time. The second item in the oilcloth was a handwritten letter. 2 pages, front and back, written in a hand that was different from the measurement notes she'd found in the tin box. More urgent, the letters larger and less controlled, like someone writing quickly or under pressure. She smoothed the pages flat and started reading. The letter was not addressed to anyone by name. It began simply, If you are reading this, then I did not get the chance to fix what I'm writing about here. The writer, who didn't identify himself anywhere in the 2 pages, laid out what appeared to be a first-hand account of a surveying dispute. He described being present during a boundary resurvey of land adjacent to what he called the Black Ridge parcel, and he described watching the survey team lead, a man he referred to only as the one Crow hired, make adjustments to the calculations that did not match the original benchmark markers. The writer said he'd objected. He said he'd been told to keep quiet. He said he'd been told that the paperwork would be filed before anyone could challenge it, and that by the time anyone noticed a discrepancy, if they ever did, the new line would be the legal line, and the old line would be something people argued about without proof. So he'd made proof. He described hiding copies of the original survey data, the field notes, and his own written account inside the fence posts along the western boundary. The posts that were there already, the Black Ridge posts, the ones that stood on what he believed was the true property line. He described doing it at night, over several weeks, pulling posts and building the chambers and resetting everything as close to how it had been as he could manage. I know this isn't enough on its own, the letter read near the end. A man finding papers in a fence post isn't going to move a judge. But it's a start. It's something. It's more than they think is out here. The letter ended mid-sentence on the back of the second page, as if the writer had been interrupted and never came back to finish it. Rowan read it twice. Then she sat back and looked at the lantern flame for a while. "Okay," she said, to no one, to the barn. She pulled her notebook toward her and started writing. But she spent the next 3 days not talking to anyone. She worked the fence during the day. Legitimate work, the work she was being paid for. But she moved differently now, with a secondary purpose layered under the official one. Every post she pulled for inspection she tested first. Every suspicious one she documented before opening. She was building a record, systematic and complete, and she was doing it without telling Dale Pruitt or Silas Holloway or anyone else that she was doing it. She told herself she just needed to understand the full picture before she brought anything to anyone. That was reasonable. That was responsible. Half-formed information handed to the wrong person at the wrong moment could complicate things. She'd seen that happen on jobs before, but not with anything like this, nothing remotely like this, but she'd seen it. You bring a problem to someone before you understand it yourself, and suddenly you're not the person solving the problem anymore. You're just the person who found it. She wasn't ready to stop being the person who was finding it. What she found over those 3 days was more than she'd expected. The glass jar she'd set aside earlier held a document she hadn't anticipated. A partial copy of a property deed, the kind that would have been recorded at the county courthouse, showing the original dimensions of the Black Ridge parcel as filed in 1947. The measurements on this deed did not match the current fence line. They matched, closely, almost exactly, the hand-drawn map she'd found on her first night. She laid the deed copy beside the map and the typed survey document on her table and stood over all 3 of them in the lamplight with her notebook open and her pencil working. The original deed said the western boundary of Black Ridge Ranch ran along a line that measured from the permanent benchmark marker at Garrison Creek, a concrete post she'd actually walked past twice already, half buried in silt but still there, placed the property line approximately 73 feet east of where the current fence stood. 73 feet. Over the full length of the western boundary, just over a mile, that was somewhere between 8 and 10 acres, depending on exactly how the line angled at the corners. 8 to 10 acres of land that included, based on the topography she'd been walking for almost 2 weeks now, the only section of Garrison Creek that ran reliably year-round. Everything else on the western edge of the region was seasonal, dry by July, dead by August. The creek section that fell inside that 73-foot strip was spring-fed, based on the vegetation around it, the kind of water source that didn't care what season it was. She did the math she'd been avoiding. For a cattle operation, water access like that wasn't a luxury. It was the difference between a viable operation and one that spent half its revenue hauling water during dry months or paying grazing fees somewhere else. Strip that access from a ranch, and you'd change the economics of the whole property. Quietly, without firing a shot, without anyone needing to sign anything they didn't want to sign. She sat down. Her knees ached. She ignored them. "Someone stole a creek," she said. She wrote it in her notebook, just like that. Someone stole a creek. Then she turned the page and started a new section. Come on. On the fourth day, she found the letter that named names. It was in the last chamber she identified, post number 9 in her sequence, set at the southwestern corner of the property where the fence turned east and started its run along the southern boundary. This post had been the most carefully disguised of all of them. The stone chamber beneath it was deeper than the others, and the capstones on top had been fitted so tightly that a thin layer of sod had actually taken root across the top of them, making the ground look completely undisturbed. If she hadn't been looking specifically for it, if she hadn't known by now exactly what she was looking for, and how the settled earth around a hidden chamber felt different from the packed earth around a real post hole, she might have walked past it. Inside, another tin box. This one larger than the first, double sealed with 2 layers of wax. Inside the tin, a folded document, a small photograph, and a third oilcloth bundle that held more letters. 4 of them, these ones addressed, with names. The photograph was old, black and white, slightly overexposed so that the faces were a little bleached out at the center. It showed 2 men standing in front of what appeared to be a survey tripod, somewhere in open country. One of the men was younger, maybe 30, in work clothes. The other was older, heavier, in a jacket that was cleaner than the setting suggested he should be. On the back of the photograph, written in pencil, Garrison Creek Resurvey, October 1962, DH and RC. She stared at the initials. RC. She'd seen that name, or the name she assumed those initials stood for, in one of the earlier documents. A passing reference, casual enough that she might have missed it if she hadn't been reading everything twice. Crow's man reran the numbers. She'd marked it in her notebook and moved on. Now she looked at the photograph again, at the older man in the cleaner jacket. RC. The folded document in the tin was the most significant thing she'd found yet, and she knew it the moment she got it open. It was a letter from the younger man in the photograph. She was fairly certain, based on the handwriting, that he was the same person who'd written the incomplete letter from the second oilcloth, to someone named Thomas Holloway. Dated November 1962, 6 weeks after the photograph. "Thomas," it read, "I'm writing this because I cannot risk coming to the ranch in person. Crow's people have been watching the road since the filing, and I don't know yet who else is involved. What I know for certain is this: the survey filed with the county in October is not the survey that was conducted. The numbers were changed between the field and the office, and the man who changed them was paid to do it. I have the original field notes. I have copies of the original deed. I have put everything I can gather into the fence posts on the western line, the ones your family put up in 1951. If something happens to me before I can bring this to a lawyer, the fence is where you look. Pull the corner post first. The land is yours, Thomas. The creek is yours. Don't let them tell you otherwise." The letter was signed, Earl Denton. Rowan read it twice, then set it down carefully on the table and pressed her palms flat against the surface the way she did when she needed to slow herself down. Thomas Holloway. That was Silas Holloway's father, or possibly his grandfather, say. She didn't know enough of the family history to be certain, but the name was too close to be coincidence. And Crow, RC. In the photograph, the man whose surveyor had rerun the numbers, Crow was a name she'd seen on the property map Dale Pruitt had sent her before she came out. The ranch that bordered Black Ridge on the west, the one whose fence she'd been walking parallel to for 2 weeks. She pulled out her phone and looked at the property map again. The neighboring ranch to the west was called Crow Valley Ranch. Current owner, according to the county assessor's website she found after 3 bars of signal and 2 minutes of loading, Gideon Crow. She looked at that name for a long time. Then she looked at the letter from Earl Denton with its final line underlined by someone, not Denton, the ink was different, in a hand that pressed hard enough to score the paper slightly. Don't let them tell you otherwise. The weather broke on the 6th day, which meant it got worse. A cold front came down from the panhandle with serious intentions, dropping the temperature 15 degrees in 4 hours and bringing with it a low, spitting rain that wasn't quite cold enough to be sleet, but was trying its best. Rowan worked through the morning, but gave it up by early afternoon when the ground got soft enough to make post setting pointless. You couldn't firm the earth around a new post when the rain was still coming down. She sat in the barn with her camp heater running and her documents spread across every flat surface she had, and she did the one thing she'd been resisting for days. She tried to build a complete picture. On one page of her notebook, she wrote what she knew with certainty. Things documented, things she'd physically found and held in her hands. On the facing page, she wrote what she was inferring, the connections between documents, the logical line from one fact to the next. The certain column was longer than she'd expected. She had the original deed copy showing the 1947 boundaries of Black Ridge Ranch with the western line clearly east of the current fence. She had the 1962 typed survey, the real one, the one conducted before the numbers were changed, showing measurements consistent with the 1947 deed. She had Earl Denton's letter to Thomas Holloway explaining that the filed survey was fraudulent, identifying the fraud as deliberate and paid. She had the photograph placing a man with the initials RC at the Garrison Creek resurvey in October 1962. She had the measurement notes from the tin box, which on closer reading over the past several days she determined were Denton's own field calculations, precise, methodical, cross-referenced against benchmark markers, showing the true line. And she had 9 fence post chambers built with the kind of careful, time-consuming precision that people don't apply to things they don't believe in. On the inference page, she wrote more slowly. The boundary was deliberately moved westward sometime between September and October 1962, giving Crow Valley Ranch approximately 8 to 10 acres of Black Ridge land, including permanent water access on Garrison Creek. The fraud was engineered through a falsified survey filing. The person who conducted the original survey, possibly Earl Denton himself, refused to go along with the falsification and documented the truth instead. Earl Denton hid this documentation inside the Black Ridge fence posts, on land he believes still legally belonged to the Holloways, addressed to Thomas Holloway. Thomas Holloway apparently never received this information, or never received enough of it to use. The Holloway family's land struggles, the years of failed lawsuits Prewitt had mentioned in passing during their first call, presumably stemmed directly from this. She stopped, read back over what she'd written. Then she wrote one more line, slowly, in capital letters. Earl Denton built this fence as a message. She underlined it. The fence wasn't a property boundary. It had never been a property boundary. It was a dead man's last honest act, carried out with a claw bar and a bag of flat stones, and the particular stubbornness of someone who knew they were beaten but couldn't bring themselves to just let the lie stand unchallenged. She felt something strange then, sitting in her cold barn with the rain coming down outside and the heater ticking and the documents spread across her table. It wasn't excitement exactly, and it wasn't fear exactly, though both of those were present in some measure. It was something closer to weight. The particular weight of knowing something that matters, knowing it in a situation where you're alone and the people who should know it don't, and understanding that the distance between those two facts is, for the moment at least, entirely your problem. She closed her notebook. She opened it again almost immediately because she'd thought of something else. How did the fence get built where it is? If the original posts are still here, the 1951 posts, the ones Denton used, then the fence wasn't rebuilt in the wrong place. It was always in the right place. Which means... She stopped writing and sat very still. Which meant the Crow fence was in the wrong place. The fence on the Crow Valley side of the line, the one she could see from the western edge of the Black Ridge property, another line of posts running parallel and maybe 70 feet away, that was the fraudulent structure. That was the fence that reflected the falsified survey. The Black Ridge fence had been correct all along. But if the Black Ridge fence was correct, and the Crow fence was what had been moved, she needed to check the original survey markers, the physical ones, the benchmarks, the concrete post she'd walked past in Garrison Creek. She needed to stand next to it with Denton's measurements and confirm exactly what she thought she was reading. She needed to do that before she talked to anyone, before she made a single phone call or said a single word to Dale Prewitt or to Silas Holloway or to anyone who might, deliberately or otherwise, give the wrong people time to prepare. She looked out through the gap in the barn siding at the rain still coming down. at the flat gray sky over the western ridge. Tomorrow, she decided, if it cleared. She'd walk the creek boundary and check the benchmark marker herself. She began to organize the documents into groups, handling each one with a care that hadn't been her default mode for most of her working life. Originals in one stack, the tin box set aside, her notebook on top of everything. She looked at the photograph one more time. The two men in front of the survey tripod, the older one with the cleaner jacket, the initials on the back. D.H. and R. See, D.H. could be Dale Holloway. Thomas Holloway's brother maybe, or a cousin. She didn't know. She might never know. The younger man in the photograph, the one she'd been reading letters from for 5 days now. She felt, strangely, like she knew him. Earl Denton, who'd watched something dishonest happen and hadn't been able to live with it. Who'd built the proof into the fence itself and written a letter to a man named Thomas and then, apparently, disappeared from the record. She wondered what had happened to Earl Denton after November 1962. She didn't have any way to know. There was nothing in any of the documents that told her. The letter was the last thing he'd put in the fence, and after the letter there was nothing but silence and 60 years of grass growing over stone chambers and secrets waiting in the dark. She turned off the camp lantern. In the dark, she could hear the rain in the heater and the low, distant sound of the wind working itself up again for another run at the ridge. She thought about the Holloway family, whoever they were now, carrying decades of arguments and court losses, and the specific exhaustion of people who know they're right but can't prove it. She thought about what it did to a family, that kind of sustained injustice, the kind that wears you down not through one big blow, but through years of smaller ones, each one chipping away at the certainty that the world could be made to account for what it took from you. She thought about Gideon Crow. She didn't know him. He might be innocent of all of it, a man who'd inherited land from his father and his grandfather without knowing the full history of how it was acquired. It was possible. People inherited things they didn't choose. They lived on land with complicated histories, and sometimes they didn't know, and sometimes they didn't want to know, and sometimes they knew perfectly well and chose not to look at it directly, which was its own category of thing. She'd find out which kind he was. But not tonight. Tonight she closed her eyes, and the rain came down, and somewhere under the wet prairie grass, along a fence line built by a man who'd run out of other options, the truth sat in stone chambers and waited, the way truth always does when there's nothing else it can do. Patiently, without complaint, for as long as it takes. The rain cleared before dawn. Rowan was already awake when it stopped. She'd been lying on her cot listening to it thin out, the drumming on the barn roof going from steady to intermittent to occasional drops, and then nothing. She got up in the dark, made coffee on the camp stove, and was out the door with her notebook and Denton's measurement records before the sky had done more than suggest the possibility of light. The ground was soft underfoot, the kind of wet that sucked slightly at her boot heels with each step, and the grass along the western fence line was heavy with water, soaking her jeans to the knee within the first 100 yards. She didn't particularly care. She'd been wet and cold on job sites before, and she'd be wet and cold on job sites again. And right now the discomfort was secondary to the specific urgency she'd woken up with. The need to stand at the Garrison Creek benchmark and confirm with her own eyes and hands what the documents were telling her. She carried a measuring tape, a compass, and the copied field notes from the tin box. She also carried, rolled in a separate piece of plastic, the original typed survey document. She had no legal authority to do what she was doing. She was a fence builder, not a surveyor. But she could read measurements and she could use a compass, and she knew what a benchmark marker looked like. And sometimes that was enough to know whether the ground you were standing on matched the paper that described it. The creek was 20 minutes from the barn on foot, cutting diagonally across the southwestern edge of the property through a shallow draw thick with cottonwoods and salt cedar. She heard it before she saw it. A low, constant sound, nothing dramatic, just water moving over rock in the way that water moves when it has somewhere to go and intends to get there. She pushed through the salt cedar and found herself on the bank. The creek was maybe 15 feet wide here, shallow and clear after the rain, running fast enough that it kicked up white around the larger rocks. She turned downstream, following the bank, keeping her eyes on the ground for the marker. She found it 40 yards along, half buried in the soft earth of the bank, the concrete cap tilted slightly downstream by decades of erosion, but still present and still legible. The benchmark designation was stamped into the metal disc set in the concrete top, GC7, with a 4-digit number below it. She crouched beside it, pulled out Denton's field notes. He'd referenced this marker specifically, GC7. He'd taken compass bearings from it to establish the boundary corners, and he'd recorded those bearings with a precision that suggested he'd done this professionally and carefully, and without any intention of being wrong. She read his numbers, then took her own bearing from the marker using her compass, turning slowly until she had the heading he'd recorded for the northwest corner of the Black Ridge western boundary. She followed that heading with her eyes, across the creek and up the low bank on the other side, into the pasture that belonged, or that the current survey claimed belonged, to Crow Valley Ranch. The Crow fence line ran approximately 60 feet inside that heading, 60 feet short of where the bearing put the actual property corner. She stood up slowly, looked at the two fence lines, the Black Ridge fence behind her, the Crow fence ahead of her, the 60 feet of contested ground lying between them, soggy and ordinary and crisscrossed by deer trails through the heavy grass. 60 feet, not 73, like the deed copy suggested at the widest point. 60 feet here, at the creek. The line angled as it went north, which explained the discrepancy. The stolen strip of land wasn't a perfect rectangle. It tapered. But 60 feet of creek frontage at a permanent water source in this part of the country was not 60 feet of nothing. It was the kind of thing cattle operations were built around, or failed around, depending on which side of the line they sat on. She stood on the Black Ridge bank of Garrison Creek for a few minutes, looking at the Crow fence, looking at the marker, looking at the water running between them. Then she pulled out her notebook and wrote down the bearing, the measurement, the marker designation, and the date and time. She wrote it in the careful, specific language she'd been using for 2 weeks because she'd understood from almost the beginning that this was going to need to be readable by someone other than herself. She crossed the creek. She told herself she just wanted to get a closer look at the Crow fence, at the post construction and the hardware, whether anything about it looked deliberately placed to mark a false line. That was partially true. But the fuller truth was that Crow Valley Ranch had a main house visible from the ridge, and she'd been trying to decide for 3 days whether to walk up to that house and knock on the door, and she'd been telling herself she wasn't going to, and here she was, standing on the wrong side of the creek. She looked up at the ridge. Smoke from a chimney, visible even from here against the pale morning sky. Someone was home. She thought about Earl Denton, who'd had the same choice, speak up or stay quiet, and had chosen a third option, the slow and careful one, the one that required patience and stones and the understanding that he might not be there to see it through. She started walking toward the ridge. The main house at Crow Valley Ranch was bigger than she'd expected, a long, low structure built in 2 phases, the original section limestone and dark wood, the newer edition done in the same materials but with the slightly too clean look of construction that hadn't weathered yet. A porch ran the length of the front. 2 trucks were parked in the yard, one work-worn and mud-spattered, one newer and clean, the kind of vehicle that belonged to someone who wanted you to notice it. She crossed the yard, stepped up onto the porch, and knocked. The man who answered was tall, maybe 65, with the kind of lean, angular build that used to be called rancher's build before people started calling everything something else. White hair cut short, a face that had spent decades in direct sunlight and wasn't apologetic about it. He was wearing work clothes, the real ones, not the costume version, but his boots were clean, which told her something about how his morning started. He looked at her without any particular expression, waiting. "Gideon Crow?" she asked. "That's right." His voice was level, not warm, not unfriendly, just level. "My name is Rowan Mercer. I'm doing the fence restoration at Black Ridge Ranch, the Holloway property, on your eastern boundary." Something shifted in his face, but barely, the way a poker player's jaw tightens when the card he needed didn't come. "I know what Black Ridge is," he said. "I thought you might want to know what I've been finding out there," she said, "while I've been working." The silence that followed lasted long enough to be intentional. "You'd better come in," he said, though his tone didn't particularly suggest he meant it as an invitation. The inside of the house was worn in the right ways. Furniture that had been expensive once and was now just comfortable. Shelves with actual books on them rather than decorative objects chosen to look like books. A kitchen visible through a doorway that smelled like coffee and something with onions. A working house. A lived-in house. He didn't offer her coffee. He led her to a sitting room off the front hall and gestured at a chair, and he sat across from her in another one, and he looked at her with the particular expression of a man who has been waiting, on some level, for a specific conversation to arrive. She'd intended to be careful about how much she showed him. She'd told herself on the walk up the ridge that she was just going to feel out the situation, see what he knew or was willing to say, keep her cards close. She'd practiced something approximating a neutral opening line. What she actually said was, "I found the documents Denton hid in the fence posts." Crow was quiet for a moment. He laced his fingers together over one knee, unhurried, looking at something past her left shoulder. "Earl Denton," he said finally, in a tone she couldn't fully read. Not shocked, not guilty. Something in between those things, or beside them. "I wondered if those were still out there. You knew about them." "I knew he'd done something. Earl was—" He stopped, started again. "He worked for my father for 3 years. He was a good surveyor, an honest one, which, depending on what you're asking a surveyor to do, can be a problem." "What did your father ask him to do?" Crow looked at her directly for the first time since they'd sat down. His eyes were the faded blue of something that had been a brighter color a long time ago. "My father asked him to file a survey that reflected what my father wanted the line to be," he said, "instead of what it actually was." The flatness in his voice surprised her. She'd expected deflection, denial, some version of "I don't know what you're talking about." She hadn't expected the thing that sounded almost like relief. "And Denton wouldn't do it," she said. "Denton wouldn't do it. My father found someone else who would." Crow shifted in his chair. "This was 1962. I was 4 years old." "That's not a defense," she said, and she said it before she'd fully decided to, the words arriving ahead of her caution. He didn't flinch. "No," he said. "It isn't." She waited. The house was quiet. From somewhere in the back, she heard the sound of a door, then boots on a hard floor, then the door again. Someone going out, not coming in. They were alone. "My father built that ranch on the back of that water access," Crow said. 40 years of cattle operation. Every head of livestock we ran. Every drought year we survived. That creek is the reason we survived. And I've known for most of my adult life that the way we got access to it was not clean." He said the last 2 words like they cost him something. "My father died in 1991. By then the Holloways had already lost 2 court cases, and the county had already confirmed our survey as the legal line, and it was done. It was the kind of thing that was done. The kind of thing," Rowan said slowly, "where the people who got robbed never stopped knowing they got robbed." "Yes." He said it without argument. "Silas Holloway," she said. "You know him?" "I know who he is. We don't speak. His family spent decades fighting your family over that line. Without proof. Every time they went to court, they lost, because the filed survey was the legal record and they had nothing to put against it." She paused. "Denton had everything they needed. He put it in the fence. And they never found it. Nobody ever pulled those posts," she said, "until me." Crow stood up. Not aggressively, just restlessly. The way people stand when they need to do something with the tension in their bodies, and walking is the safest option. He went to the window and stood looking out at the yard. His profile was unreadable from where she sat. "What are you going to do with them?" he asked. "The documents." This was the part she'd thought about the most. What she said here mattered, and she knew it, and she took a moment before answering. "I'm going to take them to the people they were meant for," she said. "Denton addressed that letter to Thomas Holloway. Silas is the Holloway who's still here." Crow turned from the window. "And after that?" "That's not really my decision. That's a legal question. For courts." "You understand what that means." His voice was still level, but there was something under it now, a tightness. "What it would mean for this ranch, for everything we built here." "What your father built here," she said, "on stolen water rights." He didn't answer that. She stood up. She was done sitting in his chair in his house with the particular discomfort of this conversation pressing down on all sides. "I'm not trying to destroy anything," she said, and she meant it, mostly. "I'm trying to finish what Denton started. He hid the truth because he wanted someone to find it. 60 years is long enough." "Ms. Mercer." His voice stopped her at the doorway. She turned. He was still standing at the window, not looking at her, looking out at the ridge. "You're not from around here. You don't understand how deep this goes. The Crows and the Holloways and Cutter County, there are people who've structured their entire lives around how this land is mapped. If you go pulling up the foundation—" "I know what happens when you build on a bad foundation," she said. "I build fences." She left him standing at the window. She was halfway down the ridge when she heard the truck start up behind the house. She didn't turn around. She kept walking, back toward the creek, her hands in her pockets and her jaw set. But she listened. The truck idled for a moment, then she heard it pull out of the yard, and she tracked the sound of it moving north along the Crow property, away from her, away from Black Ridge, up toward the county road. He was making a phone call, or going to make one in person. She didn't know who to. She didn't know how many people in Cutter County had a stake in this, how many old arrangements had been built on the assumption that the Crow survey was the permanent truth. She crossed the creek, pulled herself up the far bank, and started moving faster. Back at the barn, she went to her truck first. She unlocked the toolbox and checked the documents, all still there, exactly as she'd left them. She stood there a moment, looking at them, thinking about what Crow had said. "You don't understand how deep this goes." She understood more than he thought. She'd grown up adjacent to this kind of thing, not in the details, not in the land and cattle specifics of it, but in the general shape of it, the way power arranged itself around an established lie. The way people who'd benefited, directly or indirectly, from something unjust developed a genuine investment in its permanence, not necessarily out of malice, sometimes just out of the basic human instinct to protect what felt like yours, even if the original claim to it was rotten. She pulled the documents out of the toolbox. She wasn't going to leave them there anymore. She went back into the barn and looked at her options. Her duffel bag, her sleeping bag, her cooler. She settled on the cooler. She put the documents in a waterproof bag she used for job site plans when rain was a possibility, sealed it, and set it inside the cooler under her food. Then she sat down at the table and looked at her notebook and thought about what came next. She needed to talk to Silas Holloway. She'd been avoiding it. Not out of fear exactly, but out of something like procedural caution. She wanted to have the complete picture before she put it in front of him. She wanted to know what she had was solid before she handed it to an old man who'd spent decades losing. She didn't want to be the person who came to Silas Holloway with half a story and watch hope move across his face and then have nothing to back it up with. She thought she had enough now. She wasn't certain. There were pieces she didn't have, context she couldn't fully reconstruct. But what she had was documented, cross-referenced, and sitting in a waterproof bag in her cooler, and it told a coherent story from beginning to end. She picked up her phone and called Dale Pruitt. He answered on the second ring, sounding only slightly less inconvenienced than usual. "Miss Mercer, everything all right out there?" "Fine," she said. "The work is going well. I need to ask you something about Silas Holloway." A pause. "What about him?" "I need to contact him directly. I found something on the property that he needs to know about, not a structural issue. Something else, something personal." Another pause, longer. "What kind of something?" "The kind I'd rather explain to him face to face than over the phone," she said. "Can you give me a number for him or an address? Or set up a meeting?" Pruitt was quiet long enough that she thought he might be deciding something. Then, "He lives in Mineral Wells, about 90 miles east of you. I can call him and let him know you want to come by if that works. He doesn't get out to the property much. His health isn't great." "Tell him it's important," she said. "Tell him it's about the western boundary." The silence on the other end was different this time. Heavier. "The western boundary," Pruitt said slowly. "Yes." "All right," he said in a tone that had shifted somewhere she couldn't entirely place. "I'll call him." She hung up, sat for a moment with the phone in her hand. Then she went to the cooler and pulled out a bottle of water and drank half of it in one go, standing up, staring at nothing in particular. Outside, a hawk was working the thermals over the western ridge, circling slow and high, riding the air that came off the warmer ground above the creek. She watched it for a while through the gap in the siding. She thought about Earl Denton standing at this fence in the dark, 30 years before she was born, working a post free from the ground with cold hands. Writing his letters, sealing his tin boxes, trusting the ground to hold what the world refused to. She thought about what it meant to do a thing correctly when nobody was watching and nobody was going to know for a very long time that you'd done it at all. She went back to the fence. She still had work to do. Real work. The work she was hired for, the resetting and the replacement and the straightening that the property needed regardless of what happened with the documents. She pulled posts and set new ones and strung wire and drove staples. And the afternoon went by in the way that physical labor makes afternoons go. Faster than thought, slower than worry, in a rhythm that left just enough of her mind free to keep turning things over without getting anywhere useful. It was late, the light going orange over the ridge, when her phone buzzed. Dale Pruitt. Silas will see you. Tomorrow, 10 a.m. I'll text you the address. He says to tell you he knows what you found. She read that last line 3 times. He says to tell you he knows what you found. She stood in the middle of the fence line with wire cutters in one hand and her phone in the other, and the hawk was gone, and the sky was going purple at the edges, and the land stretched out in every direction flat and quiet and indifferent, and she thought, he's been waiting. All this time, Silas Holloway had been waiting, not for a court, not for a surveyor, for someone to pull the right fence post on an abandoned property and be stubborn enough to not put it back without understanding why it came up so easy. She texted back, I'll be there. She put the phone in her pocket and picked up the wire cutters and went back to work, the fence running straight and true in both directions from where she stood, and the last of the light burning low across the prairie. And somewhere under the grass behind her, the empty stone chambers of Earl Denton's long patience, open now, finished with their waiting, their secret finally on its way to the person it had always been meant to find. She left Blackridge at 7 in the morning. The documents were packed in the waterproof bag inside a canvas satchel she kept for job site paperwork, permits, contracts, survey references. She'd transferred everything the night before, organizing the materials in the order she planned to present them. Deed copy first, then the typed survey, then Denton's field notes, then the letters, the photograph last. She wanted Silas Holloway to understand the shape of the thing before she handed him the part that would hit hardest. The drive to Mineral Wells took just over 2 hours on roads that started rough and got progressively more civilized as she left Cutter County behind. She stopped once for gas and bad coffee at a station outside a town small enough that the station and the post office shared a parking lot. She drank the coffee standing next to her truck in the thin morning cold, and watched a cattle trailer go by on the highway, and thought about Gideon Crow standing at his window the previous morning, looking out at the ridge. She hadn't heard from him again. No calls, no trucks on the Black Ridge Road, no sense of being watched, though she'd looked for that, maybe more than was rational, checking the ridge when she went out to work and watching the county road for dust trails that didn't belong to her. Nothing. Either Crow had decided to let events unfold, or he was moving quietly through channels she couldn't see. Both possibilities were uncomfortable in different ways. She got back in the truck and drove. Mineral Wells was the kind of small Texas city that had been something once and still carried the bones of it. Wide main streets, old storefronts with good bones and struggling tenants, a water tower with the city name painted in letters large enough to read from the highway. Pruitt had sent her an address on the east side of town, a residential street lined with pecan trees old enough that their roots had buckled the sidewalk in several places. The house was small and well kept in the specific way of houses that belong to people who are no longer physically capable of keeping them as well as they'd like but are still trying. The paint was clean but applied unevenly in one corner where someone had patched rather than repainted the whole surface. The yard was mowed but edged imprecisely. A ramp had been added to the front steps recently enough that the wood was still pale, not yet weathered to match the porch. She sat in the truck for a moment, checked the time. 9:58. She picked up the satchel and got out. The man who opened the door was in his mid-70s, she guessed, though the years had settled on him unevenly, the way hard years tend to. He was heavy-set through the shoulders in a way that suggested he'd once been genuinely large, now somewhat diminished. He walked with a cane, Aluminum, functional, not the kind anyone chose for aesthetics. His face was deeply lined, his hair white and thin, his eyes the particular dark brown that doesn't fade much with age, and still held something sharp behind the surface of them. He looked at her the way people look at someone they've been expecting but weren't sure would actually come. "Ms. Mercer," he said. "Mr. Holloway, thank you for seeing me." He pushed the door open wider and moved back to let her in. His progress through the hallway was slow and deliberate, the cane taking weight off a left knee that she could see was significantly swollen even through his pants leg. He led her to a front room that was clearly where he spent most of his time. A recliner with a side table bearing a lamp, a remote, a pill organizer, and a glass of water, a couch against the opposite wall, a television dark and silent in the corner, shelves covering most of one wall, packed with a mixture of books, binders, and what appeared to be stacked folders of documents. He lowered himself into the recliner with the care of someone for whom that process required full attention. "Sit down," he said, nodding at the couch. "Dale said you found something on the western boundary." Those were his exact words. "Yes." She sat. The satchel was in her lap and she kept her hands on it, not opening it yet. "He also said—" Holloway paused, adjusted something in how he was sitting, winced slightly, and then composed himself. "He said you told him you knew what you found. I need to ask you something first before you show me anything." "Go ahead. How much of it is there?" She looked at him. "Enough," she said. Something moved through his face. Not quite relief, not quite pain. The specific expression of someone who has carried a very heavy thing for a very long time and has just been told they can put it down and doesn't quite believe it yet. "Earl Denton," he said. "You know that name." "My father knew that name. He told me about Earl Denton when I must have been 12 or 13. He sat me down and told me there'd been a man, a surveyor, who'd tried to help us and couldn't, and that he'd believed the man had hidden something on the property, but we'd never found it, and after a while—" He stopped, set his jaw. "After a while, we stopped looking." "Why did you stop?" "Because looking cost money we didn't have. Because every time my father got close to something he thought might prove the line was wrong, something went sideways. Witnesses changed their story. A document went missing from the county files. The originals, not the copies. A lawyer who'd agreed to take the case changed his mind 2 weeks before the first hearing. He said this without melodrama, just laying out the facts in the flat tone of someone who had long since finished being surprised by them. My father spent 30 years and most of what was left of our money trying to get that land back. He died without it." Rowan opened the satchel. She started with the deed copy the way she'd planned. She handed it across and watched Silas Holloway take it in both hands, settling his reading glasses from his shirt pocket without looking away from the page. He read it slowly. She didn't say anything. When he looked up, his expression had changed in some way she couldn't fully name. "This is the 1947 deed," he said. "A copy. I think it's one Denton made before the survey was run in 1962. He wanted documentation of the original boundary from before anyone could dispute it. My father had a copy of this. He filed it in the 1971 case." He paused. "The county said the copy was insufficient. They said without the original or a certified copy from the filing office, it was inadmissible." "The original deed at the filing office," Rowan said carefully. "Is it still there?" "As far as I know, it doesn't matter on its own. The 1962 survey superseded it as the established legal line. You'd need to show the 1962 survey was fraudulent to get anywhere with the deed." He looked at her over his glasses. "Do you have something that does that?" She handed him the typed survey document. She watched him read it. Watched him get to the measurements, the compass bearings, the benchmark references. Watched his reading speed slow down as he understood what he was looking at. "This is a survey of the Black Ridge western boundary," he said slowly. "Dated September 1962. A month before the survey that was filed with the county," Rowan said. "Yes." "And the measurements are consistent with the original 1947 deed, and with my own measurements from the Garrison Creek benchmark marker. I went out there yesterday morning." He was quiet for a moment. His hands holding the document were not entirely steady, though she thought that might be age as much as emotion. The one that was filed, he said. The October survey. It showed a different line. It showed the line that's been the legal boundary since 1962. But this one, she pointed to the document in his hands, shows what the line actually was. Before someone changed it. She handed him Denton's field notes next. The handwritten measurements, the careful cross-references. She watched Silas look at the handwriting and something happened in his face, a recognition that went beyond the content of the page. "I've seen this handwriting," he said quietly. "Where?" "My father had a letter, one letter, written to him by Earl Denton in, I think 1962, late in the year. He kept it. It was in a box with the case files when he died, and I kept it because—" He stopped, seemed to recalibrate. "Because it was the only piece of everything he'd tried that felt like it came from someone who actually knew what had happened." "I have that letter," Rowan said. He looked up from the field notes. "There were 9 posts along the western boundary with hidden chambers under them," she said. "Stone-lined, dry-stacked. Denton built them himself, at night, over several weeks. He put everything he had into those posts and then reset them so they'd hold. He addressed the letter to your grandfather. Your father. I don't know the family well enough to know which one Thomas Holloway was to you." "My grandfather," Silas said. His voice had gone quieter. "Thomas was my grandfather. Denton wrote the letter to him. He explained everything. The original survey, the falsified filing, who arranged it. He told your grandfather the documents were in the fence. He told him to pull the corner posts first." She paused. "Your grandfather never got the letter." "No," Silas said. "He didn't." He closed his eyes for a moment, opened them. "We didn't know where to look. We found nothing on the property, no matter how many times we walked it. My father assumed the documents were gone. Destroyed, removed. It didn't matter. Gone." His voice was careful, like he was building each sentence out of material he was still checking for load-bearing capacity. 60 years, he said. 60 years, she said. She gave him the full letter then. Denton's letter to Thomas Holloway, 2 pages, front and back. The handwriting urgent in places and careful in others, the last sentence cut off mid-thought. She watched Silas read it. He read it twice, slowly both times. When he finished, he sat with it in his lap and looked at the wall across the room, at nothing in particular for long enough that she started to wonder if she should say something. "He signed his name," Silas said finally. "Yes?" Earl Denton signed his name to this, knowing what it would mean if the wrong people found it. "I think he'd already decided he wasn't going to run," she said. "The way the letter reads, he knew he was in a dangerous position. He hid the documents in case something happened to him, but he signed his name." Silas nodded slowly, set the letter on the side table next to his water glass with a deliberateness that felt like respect. "Do you know what happened to him?" he asked. "After 1962? "I've been thinking about that," she said. "I don't have anything from the documents, but I've been thinking about it." "He disappeared," Silas said. "That's what my father believed. He tried to find him, years later, when the first lawsuit was heating up. Wanted him as a witness. Found no record of Earl Denton after December 1962. No address. No employment record. Nothing." He said the last word with a weight that made its meaning clear enough without elaboration. Rowan said nothing. There were some things you couldn't fix with a sentence, and this was one of them. She handed him the photograph last. He took it, held it under the lamp on his side table, tilting it to get the light right. He studied it for a long time. "The initials on the back," he said. "D.H. and R.C. That's what I read. D.H. He touched the image with one finger lightly at the younger man's face, bleached by the overexposure, not quite clear. "My grandfather had a brother, Dale Holloway. He worked land surveys in his 20s. He looked up. He died in 1965. My grandfather always said it was an accident, a fence line dispute that got out of hand on a property up in the Cap Rock." The room was very quiet. "R.C." He said the initials slowly, looking at the photograph. "Robert Crow, Gideon's father." He set the photograph down. He died in 1991, comfortable in his bed from what I understand, surrounded by the land he spent his life building. The flatness in his voice was controlled. She could hear the effort of the control. And we spent 30 years in court, and my father died, and his father died, and the land sat empty because I couldn't afford to run it after the legal bills, and... He stopped. She let the silence stand. She didn't try to fill it. After a moment, he said, "You went to see Gideon." "Yesterday morning." His eyes sharpened. "And?" "He knows the history. He admitted the survey was falsified. He said he'd known most of his adult life that the water access was obtained dishonestly." She paused. "He didn't try to bribe me or threaten me. He asked me what I was going to do with the documents." "What did you tell him?" "That I was going to bring them to you, and that after that, it was a legal question." Silas was quiet for a moment. He picked up his water glass and drank from it, set it back down carefully. The small, careful movements of someone who'd learned that their body required management. "There are people who'd take what you found and use it differently," he said. "Leverage, money, private settlement, no courthouse, no public record." "I know." "That option was available to you." "I know," she said again. He studied her. "Why didn't you take it?" She thought about how to answer that honestly, without making it sound more principled than it actually was in the moment. "Because it's not my land," she said, "and it's not my fight. And because Denton didn't hide those documents for someone to use them as a bargaining chip. He hid them as evidence, for a courthouse, for a legal record that couldn't be disputed the way a private arrangement can." Silas was quiet for a long moment. "He was right about that," he said. "Whatever else, he was right about that." She reached into the satchel and pulled out the last item, a manila envelope she'd put together the previous evening, which contained not the originals but a careful index she'd written in her own hand, a numbered list of every document, every object, the post location where each had been found, her own measurements at the Garrison Creek benchmark, and the date and time of each discovery. She handed it to him. "The originals stay with you," she said. "That's my record of what I found, where I found it, and when. If this goes to court, you'll need someone who can testify to the chain of custody. That's me. I'm not a surveyor or a lawyer, but I'm a witness. I can say what I found, where I found it, and what condition it was in." He took the envelope, looked at it, set it on top of the stack of documents he'd been building on the side table, the photograph on top where he could still see it. "You could lose work over this," he said. "If Crow pushes back, makes noise in the county, tells people you're a troublemaker, this region isn't large. Contractors talk." "I'm aware." "It's not nothing, Miss Mercer. Your livelihood, Mr. Holloway." She said it gently but clearly. "I know what I'm doing." He looked at her for a long moment. The sharp thing behind his dark eyes wasn't suspicion anymore. It was something she recognized from the photograph, from the younger man's face in the photograph, the one she'd decided was Earl Denton. The particular look of someone who has been doing a difficult thing alone for a long time and has just, unexpectedly, found a place to set it down. "I have a lawyer," he said, "in Abilene. She's handled land cases for 30 years. I've used her twice before, both times unsuccessfully." A pause. "I think that might change now." "I think it might," she said. He reached for the deed copy again and looked at it, running his thumb along the edge of the document in a way that didn't seem conscious. Just the physical need to confirm it was real, that it was still there, that it hadn't disappeared the way other things had disappeared over the years. "My father would have..." He stopped, tried again. "He spent everything on this. Everything he had. Not just money. He spent himself on it." His voice was steady, but the steadiness required effort. "He died thinking he'd failed. Thinking we'd just lost. That the Crows had won and that was how things were." Rowan didn't say anything because there wasn't anything to say that would fit the size of that. "He didn't fail," Silas said, almost to himself. "He just ran out of time before the answer came up." They sat in the quiet of the front room for a little while. Outside, through the front window, she could see the pecan trees moving in a light wind, the shadow patterns shifting across the buckled sidewalk. The ordinary mid-morning life of a residential street going on entirely unconcerned with what was happening inside this house. Eventually, he said, "I'll call my lawyer today." "Good. This is going to take time. It won't be fast. Even with all of this," he gestured at the documents on the side table. "It won't be fast." "I know," she said. "Courts don't move fast." "Will you be available when the time comes?" "I'll be available," she said. She picked up the now mostly empty satchel and stood. He started to reach for his cane, the automatic motion of a man who always rises when someone else does, and she said, "Please don't get up." And he settled back without argument, which told her he was in more pain than he'd let on. "Ms. Mercer," he said it as she reached the hallway, and she turned. He was holding the photograph again, looking down at it. "Do you believe in the idea that some things happen because they're supposed to?" She thought about it honestly, the way the question deserved. "I believe in the idea that some things happen because someone set them in motion a long time ago and trusted the ground to hold them," she said. "Denton put those documents in that fence believing someone would find them eventually. Someone with enough patience to pull the posts and enough sense to understand what they were looking at. Whether that makes it supposed to happen or just physics. I'm not sure it matters." He nodded. Looked at the photograph one more time. "Earl Denton deserved better than what he got," he said quietly. "Yes," she said. "He did." She walked down the hallway and out through the front door, down the new pale ramp, across the yard to her truck. She got in. Sat for a moment. The satchel was lighter than when she'd arrived, and somehow the truck felt lighter too, or she did. The particular release of weight that comes not from solving something, but from finally passing it to the right hands. She started the engine and pulled out onto the street. She had 90 miles back to Blackridge and a fence that still needed finishing. Whatever happened next with the lawyers and the courts and the long, grinding machinery of legal truth-seeking, that wasn't hers to carry anymore. She'd carried it from the fence post to the front room, and now it was where it was supposed to be. She rolled the window down and let the March air come in, cold and straight and smelling like rain-wet mesquite, and she drove east back toward Cutter County and the work that was waiting for her. Behind her, in a small house on a pecan-lined street, an old man sat in his recliner with a stack of 60-year-old documents and an old photograph of two men by a creek, and he reached for the phone and dialed a number in Abilene he'd called before without result, and he waited for the answer that he believed, for the first time in a very long time, might actually come. She finished the fence on a Thursday. Not the legal boundary. That was still being argued over in an office in Abilene, in the careful and expensive language of land law. But the physical restoration of the Blackridge perimeter fence, the work she'd been hired to do, the thing that had started all of this, that she finished on a Thursday afternoon in early April, 6 weeks and 2 days after she'd first driven down that county road with $214 in her checking account and a job listing that had called itself straightforward. The last post she set was in the southeastern corner, a new cedar post replacing one that had rotted through at the base so completely that it crumbled when she pulled it. She tamped the earth around it in the particular rhythm that her body knew without being asked, the repetitive work of doing a thing correctly. And when she was done, she stood back and looked at the corner and then looked down the fence line in both directions, east and west, the wire running true and tight, the posts plumb and solid. It was good work. Not perfect. She'd had to work around a section near the South Creek crossing where the soil conditions made deep setting impossible without equipment she didn't have, and there was a 40-foot stretch along the northern boundary where the grade change meant the wire ran slightly uneven in a way that would bug her if she let it. But it was honest work, done correctly with what she had, and the fence would hold. She loaded her tools into the truck and called Dale Pruitt. "It's done," she said when he answered. "All of it?" "All of it. I'll send you the documentation today, post locations, materials used, sections replaced versus restored. You'll want a physical walkthrough before you sign off, but the work is complete." "I'll arrange that." A pause. "Ms. Mercer, I want to ask you something, and I want you to know I'm asking as someone who's had a complicated few weeks because of everything that's been happening." "Go ahead." "Silas called me after your visit, told me what you found." Another pause, heavier than the first. "I've been managing this property for 11 years. I walked that fence line myself, twice, when I took on the account. I didn't know. She thought about how to answer that. She thought about what it meant to walk a fence line without knowing what to look for, without the particular suspicion that comes from a post that gives up too easily. The chambers were well hidden, she said. Denton knew what he was doing. I suppose. He didn't sound entirely convinced by his own absolution. That was his to work through. The lawyer, Silas's lawyer in Abilene, she's filed a motion to have the 1962 survey re-examined. I don't know how long it takes. These things take time, Rowan said. I know. Will you be available if they need a deposition? I told Silas I would be. That hasn't changed. She said goodbye and hung up and stood next to her truck in the warm April afternoon, looking out at the completed fence line, and she let herself feel what she actually felt, which was a complicated mixture of things that didn't have clean names. Satisfaction? Yes. Also a low-level worry she couldn't fully dismiss about whether Crow would move against her professionally, whether the work would dry up in the region, whether she'd made the kind of enemy that costs you more over time than you'd calculated in the moment you made him. That fear was real, and she didn't see any point in pretending it wasn't. But under all of it, something quieter. Something that felt like the specific rightness of having done a thing the way it needed to be done. Not the way that was easiest, not the way that benefited her most, just correctly. The way Denton had done it, 60 years ago, building his proof into the ground at night, trusting a future stranger. She got in the truck and drove away from Black Ridge Ranch for what she expected would be the last time. She was wrong about that, as it turned out. The legal process moved at the pace legal processes move, which is to say slowly and with frequent periods of apparent stillness that were actually, beneath the surface, full of activity she couldn't see. She got a call from Silas's lawyer, a woman named Patricia Reeves, whose voice on the phone was brisk and precise and inspired confidence in a way that had nothing to do with warmth, in late April, requesting a formal statement about the discovery of the documents. She drove to Abilene and sat in a conference room for 3 hours while Reeves and a paralegal walked her through everything she'd found, in what order, at what locations, with what condition the materials were in. She signed the statement. Reeves said thank you in a tone that meant, I'll call you if I need you, which she took as her cue to leave. In May, she worked a fence contract in the Panhandle, 3 weeks of new installation on a working ranch where the biggest complication was a stretch of caliche so hard she went through 3 drill bits getting the post holes started. Normal work, the kind that left her tired in the right ways and didn't follow her into sleep. She thought about Black Ridge sometimes, driving between sections, the flat country running past her windows. She thought about the stone chambers under the posts, empty now, all 9 of them. She'd felt something when she pulled the last object from the last chamber, the same feeling she got when she finished a fence section and stepped back to look at it, a sense of completed work, something that had been open, closed. She thought about Denton more than she'd expected to. She'd looked him up in the weeks after leaving Black Ridge, in the way she had available to her, online databases, newspaper archives, county records accessible through library websites. She hadn't found much. Earl Denton appeared in a 1959 directory of registered surveyors for the state of Texas. He appeared in 2 property surveys filed in Cutter County in 1961 and early 1962, both routine, both professionally executed, and then nothing. No death record in Texas, which meant either he'd left the state or the record was missing, or, and this was the possibility she'd tried to set down and kept picking back up, he had ceased to generate records in the way that people sometimes cease to generate records when powerful people want them to. She hadn't shared this specific train of thought with Silas. He'd arrived at it himself, she was fairly certain, based on what he'd said about his grandfather's brother Dale Holloway, who died in 1965 in what Thomas Holloway had always called an accident. The pattern of those years, the survey, the fraudulent filing, Earl Denton's disappearance, Dale Holloway's death, had the shape of something that had been managed rather than something that had simply happened. She couldn't prove it. Nobody alive could probably prove it. But she felt the weight of it when she thought about the photograph, the 2 men at the survey tripod, DH and RC, and the fact that one of those men had built a legacy of stolen water rights that kept his family comfortable for 60 years, and the other had vanished from the public record before Christmas of 1962. Some things don't get their reckoning in a courthouse. Some of them just become the weight that a truth carries when it finally surfaces, the full accounting of what it costs to keep it buried. She thought that was worth knowing, even when it couldn't be fixed. The call from Patricia Reeves came in August, on a Wednesday afternoon when Rowan was sourcing posts at a lumberyard outside Lubbock. "The motion has been granted," Reeves said, without preamble. "The court has ordered an independent survey of the Black Ridge western boundary to be conducted against the original 1947 deed and benchmark markers. The 1962 survey filing is under formal challenge." Rowan stood in the lumberyard with cedar dust on her jeans and sawdust in her hair and said, "How long will the survey take?" "The independent surveyor has been appointed, probably 6 to 8 weeks for the work and report. After that, the court reviews and rules." A pause. "Ms. Reeves, Rowan, I want you to understand that this isn't over. Crow Valley's legal team will challenge the independent survey's methodology. They will challenge the chain of custody on the documents. They will attempt to discredit the documents themselves, argue that they're not authentic, that they were planted, that the stone chambers were constructed recently. Can they make that argument stick?" "No," Reeves said flatly. "I have a materials expert who can date the construction of those chambers to within a decade of the 1960s based on the type of stone, the mortar-free dry stacking technique, and the oxidation pattern on the tin boxes. I have a handwriting expert who has already confirmed the Denton documents are consistent with paper and ink composition from that era. I have your contemporaneous field documentation of every discovery." She paused. "What they can do is make this expensive and slow. What they cannot do is make the evidence go away." "Okay," Rowan said. "I wanted you to hear it from me that this is going to hold." After she hung up, she stood in the lumberyard for a while, not doing anything in particular. The yard smelled like fresh-cut wood and dust, and overhead the West Texas sky was doing what it did in August, enormous and white-hot and completely indifferent to everything beneath it. She thought about Silas Holloway sitting in his recliner with the photograph on his side table. She thought about Thomas Holloway, who had spent 30 years fighting and died thinking he'd failed. She thought about Earl Denton pulling fence posts in the dark, fitting stones together, sealing tin boxes with wax, signing his name to a letter he knew might never arrive. She did not cry. She wasn't built that way, generally. But she stood very still in the lumberyard for a few minutes and let herself understand the full weight of what had just moved, and she thought it deserved at least that much. Then she went back inside to finish ordering her posts. The independent survey was completed in October. It confirmed, with the precision of modern equipment and the clarity of documented benchmark references that had been sitting in Garrison Creek for over 60 years, that the true western boundary of Black Ridge Ranch lay 71 to 77 feet east of the current Crow Valley fence line, that the permanent water access on Garrison Creek, the spring-fed section that ran year-round, fell entirely within the Black Ridge boundary as established by the 1947 deed. The surveyor's report also noted, in a section marked as supplementary observation rather than official finding, that the original Black Ridge fence posts appeared to have been set in locations consistent with the true boundary, not the falsified one. That the fence Rowan had spent 6 weeks restoring was, in fact, exactly where it had always been meant to stand. Patricia Reeves called her with this detail specifically. "I thought you'd want to know," she said. "Your fence is in the right place. It's the crow fence that was built wrong." Rowan was driving when the call came through. She pulled over on the shoulder of a county road somewhere between Abilene and nowhere in particular, and she sat with the engine running and the phone in her hand, and she looked out at the flat country and the late October light going gold across the dry grass. "Yeah," she said, "I figured." The Crow Valley legal team filed 3 separate challenges to the independent survey over the following 6 weeks. All 3 were reviewed and denied. The evidence was what it was, and the courts, slow, grinding, imperfect mechanisms that they are, reached the conclusion that the evidence pointed to. In December, Gideon Crow agreed to a settlement rather than allow the case to proceed to a full trial. The terms, as they were explained to Rowan by Patricia Reeves in a phone call 2 days before Christmas, were these. The official property boundary of Black Ridge Ranch, would be adjusted to reflect the true line as established by the 1947 deed and confirmed by the October survey. Crow Valley Ranch would cede the contested strip of land, including the Garrison Creek water access, to Silas Holloway. There were financial components to the settlement as well. Compensation for decades of lost water access, for the costs of failed litigation, that Reeves described in terms that made clear Crow had not come out of this experience cheaply. He didn't fight it at the end, Reeves said. Not the way I expected. His lawyers pushed hard, but Crow himself, I don't know. Someone told me he stopped contesting the core facts about 6 weeks ago. Just let his lawyers work the procedural angles. Rowan thought about a man standing at his window, looking at a ridge, saying it was done in the tone of someone who'd known for 30 years what that cost, and had finally run out of ways to not look at it. He knew, she said. Apparently, Reeves said, knowing and doing something about it are two different things, in my experience. In everyone's experience, Rowan said. Silas called her on the 23rd of December. She was at her sister's house in San Angelo, helping assemble a bookshelf that had come in too many pieces and had instructions written by someone who clearly hated the people who would eventually need to follow them. She stepped outside onto the back porch to take the call, the cold air hitting her after the warm house. "Miss Mercer," he said. "Rowan," she said. She'd told him that 3 times now, and he still defaulted to the formal, which she'd decided was just how he was built. Some people are. "Rowan." A pause. "The paperwork was finalized today. The new boundary survey has been filed with the county. The land it's back where it belongs." She leaned against the porch railing. The sky was clear and cold, the kind of December night where the stars look almost aggressive. "How does it feel?" she asked. A long pause, the longest she'd heard from him. "Like something I've been holding very tight for a long time, just let go," he said finally. "And my hands don't quite know what to do yet." She understood that. The aftermath of carrying something is often stranger than the carrying itself. "My father would have..." He stopped, started again. "I keep thinking about what I'm going to do with the land, the whole ranch, whether to work it again or sell it or... I don't know yet. But the creek is ours, the water is ours. Whatever I decide, it's ours." "That's enough for now," she said. "You don't have to know what to do with it yet. You just got it back." "Yes." A pause. "I want to ask you something. Patricia tells me you refused the additional compensation she tried to include in the settlement agreement, the acknowledgement fee. Reeves had offered to include a formal finder's fee in the settlement, a percentage based on the value of the recovered land. It had been a reasonable offer. It had also been a number large enough to fix the rear tires on her truck and handle several other things she'd been deferring. "I was hired to restore a fence," she said. "I restored the fence. The documents, that wasn't a service I provided. That was just something that needed doing." "That's not how the rest of the world operates," Silas said. "I know," she said. "I operate how I operate." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Earl Denton would have liked you, I think." She didn't know how to respond to that. She thought about the letter, the careful handwriting, the last sentence cut off mid-thought, the signed name at the bottom, the man who'd chosen the slow, patient, costly version of honesty over every easier option available to him. "I hope so," she said. They said goodbye in the way of people who don't expect to talk often, but understand they're connected now by something that doesn't go away. She hung up and stood on the porch in the cold for a few minutes, looking at the stars. What she'd learned, over 6 weeks on an empty ranch with a malfunctioning water pump and a fence full of 60-year-old secrets, was something she'd suspected but hadn't fully understood until she'd lived it. She'd learned that the truth doesn't need a champion, exactly. It doesn't need someone brave and decisive and unafraid. It just needs someone stubborn enough to keep pulling posts when they should keep moving, patient enough to read what they find, and honest enough to pass it to the right hands instead of the most convenient ones. She wasn't a hero of this story. That designation, if it belonged to anyone, belonged to a surveyor named Earl Denton, who'd chosen integrity in a moment when it cost him everything and built his evidence into the ground like seeds, trusting the land to hold them until someone came along who would know what to do with them. She'd just been the someone. That was a thing she could live with. That was, in fact, a thing she was proud of. 1. The new fence along the Black Ridge western boundary went up in March, a year after she'd first pulled the old corner post and felt it give. She hadn't expected to be the one to build it. But Silas had called in February through Pruitt, formally, with a contract and a day rate, and the job was exactly what she would have chosen for herself if she'd been choosing. New build, single fence line, just under a mile, running from the renovated southern corner of the property to the northern ridge along the survey line that Earl Denton had measured in September 1962 and hidden in the ground for 61 years. She started from the Garrison Creek benchmark marker, the way Denton had. She took her own compass bearing from GC7, using the same heading he'd recorded in his field notes, and she drove her first post at the creek corner exactly where the bearing put it. She worked north from there, straight and methodical, one post at a time, the proper distances apart, the proper depth, the wire strung tight enough to hold but not so tight it would fail in cold weather when the metal contracted. There was no ceremony to it. She was alone, the way she always worked best, with her truck and her tools and the specific quiet of the open country in early spring, the grass coming back pale green from the winter brown, the creek audible when the wind went right. She thought about a lot of things while she worked. She thought about her father, who taught her the basics of fence work when she was 12 years old, and impatient and didn't want to be doing it, and how he'd said the same thing every time she rushed a post. You do it right the first time, or you do it twice. Those are the only choices. She thought about Denton pulling his posts in the dark. She thought about Silas and his recliner, his hands not knowing what to do with themselves after decades of holding something tight. She thought about what it meant to do a thing honestly when the dishonest option was easier and more profitable and nobody was watching. She thought it meant exactly what it sounds like it means, and not one thing more. No great revelation, no sudden clarity about the nature of the world, just the quiet, durable satisfaction of knowing that when the moment arrived, the specific moment that was hers and nobody else's, she'd made the choice she could live with. The fence took 4 days to build. On the 4th afternoon, she drove the last post at the northern ridge marker, tamped the earth solid around it, and strung the final section of wire. She walked the whole line from south to north, checking every post, pressing each one to confirm the hold. All solid, all true. She stood at the northern end and looked back down the line toward the creek. A mile of new fence running straight across the early spring prairie, the posts pale and clean, the wire catching the afternoon light. On the eastern side of it, Black Ridge Ranch, 800 acres, water access restored, boundary confirmed. On the western side, Crow Valley Ranch, smaller now by the measurement of a deed that should never have been altered, running behind a fence line that finally, after 61 years, stood where it was supposed to stand. It was not a dramatic sight. It was a fence. It looked like a fence. But she knew what it had taken to put it there, and the knowing made it something else, something that didn't have a name she'd ever heard used for a fence line, but that felt significant in the way that things feel significant when they've been a long time coming. She packed her tools, loaded the truck, walked once more to the creek, and looked at the water running clear and cold over the rocks, the spring-fed constancy of it, the particular indifference of water to everything that human beings had argued about and documented and hidden and found in the years it had simply been moving. The creek didn't care whose it was. It had been running the same way before the Holloways and before the Crows and before anyone with a deed or a surveyor's rod had come anywhere near it. But it mattered that the line was right now. It mattered that what was true on paper matched what was true on the ground. Not for the creek, for the people living on either side of it, who deserved to know where they actually stood. She drove away from Black Ridge Ranch for the second and final time on a Thursday afternoon in March. The truck loaded, the job complete, the fence standing solid and honest behind her in the late light. She had 300 miles to drive before dark, a new contract starting Monday, and rear tires that still needed replacing but would hold another week if she didn't push it. She had a name she'd carry for the rest of her working life, Earl Denton's name and what it stood for, and the particular satisfaction of work that had mattered, done in a way she didn't need to apologize for or explain to anyone. The road unrolled ahead of her, flat and straight into the long Texas evening. She drove toward it. Behind her, the fence stretched out across the prairie, post by post, wire catching the last of the light, marking a line that was finally, honestly, exactly where it had always been meant to be. Some things take 60 years to find their place. Most things, in the end, do find it. That's not justice, exactly. But it's something close enough that it matters. It matters enough.